Dead Man's Gold by Colin Webster. The muzzle of the pistol was pointed right between my eyes. Things had gotten a little tense. "Now, Roy," I started. "Now, Roy, nothin'!" Roy screamed. The crotchety old miner's eyes were wild. His voice was high and crackin'. His trigger finger was a mighty twitchy. "Show me them sleeves, Bill, and no sudden moves." I swallowed. I'd just been called a liar and a cheat, a reputation in this country that was often as short-lived as it was deadly. The Yukon was filled with them, but those who carried that stain were often referred to in the past tense. The night had started off well enough. I had a little claim on a river just a few miles north of the little mining camp. There was an office where a man could wait and sell his gold, a general store, and a few rough log cabins would build themselves as taverns. We called it a town, but it wasn't but a smattering of crude log structures dotting the great wide wastes of the Yukon. Barrels of whiskey were hauled up by dog sled, and men poured into the country with big hopes, while others left with broken dreams. They were the lucky ones. There were plenty who never had the chance to regret their mistakes. Soft men who just gave up and died, hard men who didn't build a fire in time, or who threw caution to the wind in search of that great golden dream, and died just the same. We all went sooner or later, though it looked like my dance card had just been called. "Last time, Bill, show me them sleeves," the old man threatened, and thumbed back the hammer of the revolver. Slowly, calmly, I spread my hands, and turned back the edges of my sleeves, rolling them up. No aces tumbled to the table. No discarded cards fluttered to the floor. "No!" the wizened, bent oldster wailed, more upset at the fact that I wasn't cheatin' than he probably would have been if I was. I'd won the prize fair and square. He'd come in just minutes ago, dancing about just as spry as the spring chicken he was decades and decades ago. Now he was bent and old, skinny and drawn, his life worked out of him in that cold and frozen north, in pursuit of just such a nugget as he held in his hands. I knew it was trouble from the moment he walked in. You don't go parading around with a big old chunk of gold like that. I never even dreamed of seeing one that big. I knew right then by the way the other men eyed that big rock that there would be blood. I just didn't count on it being mine. The old man stamped his feet and raged, his treasure lost the same day he'd found it. The sheer joy of finally having a life's work of misery and loneliness proved too much for him. He'd lost all thought of caution and just had to share his good fortune with some other breathing soul. That kind of sentiment was lethal as the cold outside round these parts. More than one man lay in a shallow grave or just froze stiff as the pines till springtime, having made the mistake of letting on that he held a few nuggets on his person. A smart man pled poverty, no matter how much luck he'd had. Rough characters hung around each and every settlement, doing more listening than panning, waiting outside the town to backshoot some poor soul and marching in on with nothing but dreams of wealth that would soon be his on his mind. More than one man had disappeared altogether after word got around that his claim was producing, and some feller would be squatting there with a deed of sale and a tale of how the man had suddenly decided to move to greener pastures. More than one of those had been hung too, after a north country jury decided he was more likely lying than not. I'd just come in for a few games of cards, and to see some other living souls, hear the news, months old from far-off places, not caring how long ago it happened. We jawed about petty happenings in other parts of the world, arguing over issues what were probably long since resolved by the involved parties. But the old man had come in, and sat down at the table where we was playing cards. He made a few small bets with little bags of gold dust, or a small pile of flakes. Didn't have a bill on him. He'd lost badly, but he kept on playing. That's when he started drinking, and he bet his tools outside, then his sled, and then his claim, laughing all the while about how it didn't matter, 'cause he wouldn't be needing them anymore, being a rich man now and all. He kept reaching down and patting that great chunk of yellow metal like it was the most precious thing in the world to him, and I'd no doubt it was. That was why I tried to talk him out of it when he heaved it up on the table. The pot was huge, stacks of bills and gold watches, and little bags of gold dust, and at least one other claim. We were all drunk and betting more than we should have, and the old man thought he'd go for broke, or get it all back and then some, or just plain couldn't help the sight of that much precious metal just a-settin' there on the table like that. He had the fever. He wouldn't listen, said his luck that day was unbeatable, and Lady Fortune had just made him lose before to set him up for an even bigger payday. I just about walked away then, 'cause the odds were against him, but I was already in for more than I should have bet, and besides, the other men around that table would have won it from him if I didn't, and I had 4 aces in my hand. But, if I was telling the truth, there was the same touch of the fever in my eyes as well. The old man wailed like a harpy. Tears stained his weathered cheeks. I could almost feel the years of toil and disappointment come washing back over him, and he seemed to shrink a few inches right there before my eyes. He'd had more wealth than he ever saw in his life come and go in one day. I might have felt more of a tug on my heartstrings if he hadn't pointed that gun in my face. The rest of the men stood back. A bet was a bet, but a man with a gun was a man with a gun, and no one wanted to get involved further than to watch. I'd been called a cheat and a liar, but to most, I had just proved I wasn't. There were a few that, if I lived, would probably never have played cards with me again. That look, that crazy, empty, dead look, came over the old man's eyes, and I knew it was time. I threw myself to the side as his gun roared. I smelled the acrid smoke even as I stuffed my hand under my coat and drew out my own pistol. My own gun bucked and roared once, twice, but it was own sounded dull and far away. The life snapped back into the old man's eyes, wild and scared, and then his knees buckled and he fell. 2 red spots widened and spread on his shirt, just above the heart. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. He stretched out a trembling hand towards the great big hunk of gold on the table. My gold. He went limp and slumped forward, where he lay still on the floor. I looked around the room. No one spoke. I felt like defending myself. Hadn't I proved I wasn't a cheat? But it wasn't condemnation in their eyes. Beady little orbs shifted back between me and my gun to the heavy, shiny rock on the table. I snatched it up. I didn't point my gun at anyone, but I kept it out and ready. I didn't even bother with the bills on the table or the rest of the pot. Best leave them to argue over how to divide the rest of the spoils than to just think about me and my treasure. "There's enough there on that table to see that man buried, and then some," was my only remark, my voice coming choked and rough. I backed out of the room into the cold and dark. The wind bit at my face, but I strapped the gold down tight and rode the sled all the way back to my cabin on the stream, miles to the north. The snows were just starting, and there wasn't a lot of time left until panning got real hard. I stopped every now and then, half expecting to hear dogs being mushed somewhere behind me, someone coming for my gold. I even tied the dogs to a tree and doubled back down the trail to set and wait in the woods with my rifle. No one came, and when my teeth wouldn't stop chattering, I stamped back through the snow and continued home. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I didn't pan the creek, not yet frozen over, thin sheets of ice framing it here and there. I put on a lot of coffee, and smoked my pipe, and thought. I needed to take this into the office, get it weighed and sold, and go south, my pockets full of money. I had no doubt there would be trouble, and I was only one man against a veritable army of hard men with rifles each, all wanting my gold. I'd seen the look in their eyes. I was surprised no one had come yet, trying to catch me sleeping in the night. There could be someone out there, right now. Sometimes I tried to play cards, but mostly I schemed and plotted, trying to figure a way to make it south. I could pack up and go to the next sorry excuse for a settlement, but there would be the same result. As soon as anyone seen or heard of the gold, I was a dead man. They all would want it. Men might even be waiting in the woods for me right now just to try such a thing. It was too risky. I'd never set foot in the camp again. Even if I left the gold here, which was unthinkable, there'd be someone mushing dogs for my cabin to seek and find my gold. If they wasn't there already, just setting there in the woods, waiting. I mulled it over and over, interrupted only by my fantasies of what I would do with all that wealth. I would go somewhere warm, always warm. I'd marry a pretty gal. They'd all want to know me. Folks would whisper when I walked by. They'd say, "There goes the man what's had the biggest gold nugget ever found." They'd write about me in the newspapers. I kept the rifle by the table, my gun to hand all the time. A body never knew when they might try and strike. I awoke of a sudden on the third morning, not realizing I'd gone to sleep. I sprang from the chair and pointed the gun, but there was no one there. I heard something outside, a crunch on the snow. Must have been what woken me. I fetched up the rifle and used it to poke open the door at night, and I leaned one careful eye out. Farley Jenkins stood on the runners of his sled, his dogs whining and nipping at each other in the traces. When he saw I was looking at him over the rifle, he lifted his hands from the sled and held them out from his side, staying very still. "What do you want, Farley?" I shouted from the crack in the door. "Just came to warn you, Bill. There's a lot of men hanging around town, all carrying rifles. There's some what'll stay ways out in the woods. No real reason for them to be just a-settin' there, 'cept for what a body might guessing for." "Sure do appreciate that, Farley. Why'd you come all the way out here? Just to tell me?" "Just thought you should know, Bill. You done me a good turn last year. Grub staked me some flour and coffee when I run low. It was a bad year, that. Hate to see a good soul have something bad happen to him. All on account of some gold, you know." I noticed Farley had his rifle unstrapped and in easy reach, and he wore his gun outside of his coat. "Mighty kind of you, Farley, but you'd best be on your way." "Okay, Bill. Just thought I'd warn you. But a body sure could use a hot cup of coffee. It's right cold out here today." "I'm fresh out," I lied. The silence just kind of hung in the air a minute, but when I neither spoke nor lowered the rifle, Farley just shrugged and mushed off. I closed and barred the door. My legs felt shaky. I needed sleep and some food. I suddenly realized I hadn't ate a thing since I'd held the nugget in my arms the first time. I'd scarce put it down, except to pick up the rifle and creep to the windows for a careful look. I hadn't fed the dogs. I hadn't gone outside, fearful there might be a man with a rifle in the woods, just waiting for such an opportunity. I brewed more coffee and sat with the nugget on my lap. The rifle leaned up against the chair. They could come for it. I was ready. A light snow began to fall, becoming wetter and heavier as the dark approached. I could see a sliver of sky through the cabin window. Crazy streaks of quivering light danced and frolicked in the sky. I covered us up in a blanket, me and the nugget, to ward off the chill, even though the fire was stoked hot. I kept blinking off the sleep that come with the darkness, threatening to overtake me any second. It was a battle of will. Part of my brain kept telling me to go ahead and close my eyes, just for a moment. The other half was urging me to bolt out the door and fire off a few shots into the woods, just to give the bastards that were surely waiting out there something to think about. It was near midnight when I just couldn't hold my eyes open any longer. My third day without sleep. The coffee wasn't helping, no matter how many times I brewed it. I was chewing the grounds from the bottom of the cup, but it didn't help. A lazy cloud of pipe smoke hung heavy in the room. The snow fell soft and slow outside the window. I watched it, lulled by the thick white curtain falling soundlessly to cover the ground, growing higher and higher. A foot crunched against the snow just outside the door. I leapt up, the rifle suddenly in my hands, rapidly blinking the sleep from my eyes. The cabin was a furnace. I was hot and felt slimy in my clothes. Sweat dripped from my nose and brow. I swung the rifle back and forth from the window and the door, unsure where the threat would come from. My teeth ground together. Blood rushed in my ears. Another footstep, right outside. The snow that revealed it also muffled the direction. Blood rushed in my ears. Blood rushed in my ears, so I could not tell from whence it came. My nerves, strung tight for days, shattered. I fired through the cabin door, then through the window, then through the wall, back and forth, again and again. Finally the gun clicked. Empty. Arms and legs shaking, fingers fumbling, I sprang across the cabin for a box of shells. I stumbled, lurched for the box, knocking it. Rushed in my ears. Get off the shelf. Cartridges spilled across the floor. I let out a cry and crouched, snatching up the little brass cylinders as fast as I could. The cabin door flew open. I froze. It could not be! The man that stood in the doorway was blue and gray. They'd bury him in his rough, tattered clothes. The skin on his hands and face was pale and icy. My jaw dropped open. The old man's eyes were white as ice. His clothes cracked as he moved, frozen solid. Snow was piled up on his hat and shoulders. It slid loose and fell on the pine boards. He took a step forward, then another. His jaw crackled. His teeth parted. In a voice that was barely more than a ragged whisper, he spoke. "Where is my gold?" I trembled, the empty rifle falling uselessly from my hands. "Where is my gold?" he shouted, and a lightning bolt of pure fear surged through my shattered nerves. I leapt back and away, but ran into the wall, my feet still shuffling, like they was trying to go further. He shambled towards me, one arm outstretched, his mouth yawning. There was dirt and snow in it. It tumbled out as his teeth clacked together, again and again in time with his steps. Clack, clack, clack. My spine tingled, every nerve and fiber stood on end, just watching him cross the rough floor towards me. Then everything broke loose, and I bolted, trying to run past him. His arm shot out and snatched me up by the collar, spun me around. His other arm took me by the throat, and he lifted me from the ground. I could feel the cold in his hands, like ice against my skin. "Give me my gold!" he demanded, clods of grave dirt and ice chips working themselves free of his teeth, tumbling down his stained shirt. That's when I remembered my revolver. My hand closed around the butt of the 6-gun. I tugged it free. I kicked out against him, breaking free of his terrible grip. I lifted the gun and fired, putting 2 more rounds on each side of the 2 holes already in him, but on he came. I backed away, firing again and again, but still he came on. I lifted the gun a few inches, took a breath, forced my arm to be still, and drew a bead right between his eyes. The gun barked once more, and a gaping hole appeared in his forehead. I could see right through it. The big nugget glittered through the window I'd made through the old codger's brain. And still he came for me, with those slow, shuffling steps. A fresh surge of fear wrenched my gut, and I threw the revolver at him and ran for the door. The gun bounced off his shoulder, tumbling away. It was useless now. One gnarled hand racked my back, but I tore free before he could get a grip and made for the door. On the way my arm shot out as if of its own volition and grabbed the heavy nugget. I fled the cabin, the nugget tucked under my arm. The snow fell like an endless cold blanket that muffled the sound of my feet on the snow and my gasping breaths. A shadow leaped ahead of me on the white ground, cast long and large as the dead man framed himself in the doorway and lurched outside. The shadow of his arm seemed to close around me as I fled wildly into the curtain of gently falling flakes. All was dark and white at the same time. The flakes melted on my skin, dripping water down my face and neck, to freeze solid almost instantly on my shirt. I dug my heels in, waving my arms to keep my balance as I slid to a stop. I'd almost fallen in the creek. As scared as I was, to fall in that water this time of year meant I was a dead man. My cabin in the roaring fire was not far away, but the dead man was back there, a-searching for me. I turned this way and that, trying to figure out which direction I should flee. It was miles to town, but if I ran there was a good chance I could make it. I wasn't dressed for the weather, and a man could freeze in that Arctic night faster than he could regret the occurrence, but if I ran fast I might stay warm enough long enough to make town. Finding my way there was another question entirely. My mind raced. The trails would be covered over in fresh snow, even the trail that Farley had made this morning. I couldn't use the stars to guide me, but I'd made the trip dozens of times. There might be a chance I wouldn't stumble blindly past the settlement, oblivious to the lights and sounds hidden by a curtain of falling snow. The dead man appeared out of the white haze, arms outstretched. I stumbled back, and my legs went out from under me as I dropped. The thin framework of ice on the bank shattered beneath my weight, and I plunged into the icy water. My skin felt like it was burning. I screamed, but it all came out a shrill gargle under the water. My hands and feet already felt numb, but I sat up in the creek and felt around frantically for my gold. My fingers brushed against something hard, and I snatched it up, clutching the treasure tight against my chest. Hard fingers wove into my hair, and I was plunged under the water. I pushed against the ground, the gold falling from my hands again. I reached out for it, got one hand on it, and then it was ripped from the water into the freezing air. The heat seemed to be sucked right out of my head. I felt my thoughts come suddenly slow and muddled. I blinked away the ice forming on my eyelashes. A blue, blotched, wrinkled face jutted against my own. "Give me my gold!" the dead man howled, and then I was plunged back into the dark water. I struggled against the icy muck at the creek bottom, but with iron strength the hand held me under. My hand slipped over the heavy nuggets sunk in the muck. I was pulled free, dripping icy water. "Give me my gold!" the dead man shouted. "You want your gold? Here!" I shouted, and with both hands slugged the frozen corpse with the nugget. The sound of ice cracking rang in my ears as the nugget hit him upside the chin. The dead man fell back, and I sloshed through the stream and back into the freezing night. I ran, my legs burned with effort, and the ice crackling again and again as it froze and broke and froze again on my trousers. I shivered violently, but the only hope now was the cabin and fire. I ran on, and I should have been to the cabin but wasn't. I'd run a straight line from the creek, and should have wound up right at my door, but my feet were numb and I'd gone at least a few hundred yards, or near about. A dark shape loomed suddenly behind me, and my feet broke free of the ice that had formed where it paused for but a moment, dripping water. I fled. There was no choice now but to keep running, taking one short step after another, freezing air filling my lungs, my hair frozen stiff with ice. On I ran. Chances were I'd lose all ability to move soon, too racked with a violent shivering to control my muscles and sinews. The old-timers said it was peaceful near the end. A man freezing to death felt warm and calm, and just kind of slipped away. I never figured how a body could know that, 'cept them that done it, and them what done it weren't sayin'. Maybe I could ask the dead man when he caught me. Or maybe he wouldn't catch me. I'd freeze to death and be covered with snow, leaving him to walk on in an endless storm, searching for his gold. I laughed maniacally at the thought. I ran on. My steps came slow now. I was stumbling all over myself, but still I pushed on. It was my gold. My gold! I leaned against a tree, rubbing the gold against my face. It felt warm and good. It comforted me. It wanted me. It wanted to stay with me. I shook my head. I was losing my mind. My teeth chattered so loud I almost didn't hear the crunch of snow when the dead man came lurching out of the night and grabbed hold of me. I shrieked and stumbled away, icy fingers slipping over my icy clothes, but the nugget fell away, buried deep in the snow. The dead man bent, began digging with both hands in the snow. His jaw had torn away, probably when I'd hit him with the nugget, and his tongue worked against his upper teeth. "Yukon!" he screamed, clawing at the snowbank. "My gold!" A cold rage consumed me, and I kicked out with my boot, sending the dead man sprawling in the snow. I reached down till my hands hit something smooth and hard, and came up with the nugget. It was mine. "Gold!" he screamed again, but I was already off and running. My feet crunched against the snow, my boots growing thicker and heavier with the stuff as layer after layer clung to my feet. My legs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, but on I ran. Death might take me, but I would die with the gold in my hands, and that meant it was mine, forever. I stumbled, my shoulder glancing off a tree. A fallen pine tangled my legs, and I plunged into the snow. I struggled to breathe, staring up at that white blanket of snowflakes covering me. A gurgling cry filled my ears. I could see the dark shape looming over me once again in the darkness. I rolled as the dead man came tumbling forward, arms clutching for me. As he pushed himself back up for another lunge, I scrambled to my feet and strode forward. I couldn't run. Exhaustion and cold had taken their toll. I could barely put one foot in front of the other. The trees changed, shifted before me. They got shorter and smaller all at once, other little trees tied across them. Tied? Across? My mind worked slowly. Crosses? Wood crosses! I had nearly reached the settlement. Only a mile away there was an Indian burial ground. When the Inuit had pulled their stakes as the white man had moved in, we'd figured to bury our dead right alongside where they buried theirs. I stumbled forward. I could make the settlement. I could make it. There'd be axes and men and fire and warmth, sweet, sweet warmth, and it seemed like I couldn't imagine how it felt to be warm again. My heart pounded, my blood felt thick. I couldn't feel my fingers or my ankles. I took a step and fell headlong. A great big puff of snow blew up in the air as I hit bottom of the open grave. Terrified, I struggled to my feet. I was in a grave. The thought chilled me to my already frozen bones. The thought of death suddenly became so clear, so final, that it cut through the fog surrounding my brain like a knife. Screaming unintelligibly, I scrambled out of the grave. My chest heaved in great seething gasps. The shadow stalked forward out of the night. The dead man's tongue lolled in the cavernous hole his missing jaw had left behind. His white, empty eyes seemed to pierce right through me. I didn't have the strength to rise, to fight. He had me. He would get his gold. My gold, he growled through his ruined mouth. The finality of my approaching death had sobered me. Gold was worth nothing to a dead man, even if this one hadn't realized it. "You want your gold?" I screamed at him. My voice came out in a hoarse cry. "Take it!" I bellowed, and I tossed the gold as far from me as I could. It landed in the grave. The dead man gave a mangled cry of delight and tumbled in after it. All was silence. I struggled to push myself up to my knees. I crawled to the edge of the grave. The dead man lay silent, still, his arms clutching the great big nugget like a newborn babe. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, how I found my way, or how I managed not to freeze to death out there in that frozen wilderness. I woke on the floor of the cabin, next to the fire. The door lay wide open, a drift of snow piled in the door. I ended up having to cut off more than a few of my toes, already turned black, and my right little finger. I singed the wounds with the bottom of the coffee pot to stanch the bleeding, and poured whiskey over the burn, bandaging my feet tight with clean strips of linen from my bed. I fed the dogs and drank 3 steaming pots of hot coffee. I ate a whole side of bacon, and then used the grease to make flapjacks. I packed what flour, salt, and necessaries as I could onto the sled, and pointed the sled south. The dogs barked in their traces, eager for a run on the new-fallen snow. Before I closed up, I scrawled a note and nailed it to the door of the cabin. It read, "To whoever may find this, the cabin is yours. The deed to my claim is in the tin can on the table. I left the great big nugget of gold I won in the poker game in town here. It lies in the grave of the man I killed over it. You are more than welcome to it. Signed, Bill."